I'm going to talk to you today about two new projects. Well, they're probably new projects to you, but projects that we've had in the office for 4 years. We won them both in competition in 2016. One is for Westminster City Council, and one is for Hackney Council. Our Coroner's Court, very close to the House of the Parliament on Horseferry Road, and a housing project in Hoxton. Oops, excuse me. There we go. I'm going to talk to you also about the background to the term civic architecture, and I'm hoping that this talk will work in tandem with the last talk that I gave, so that those of you that tuned in and heard me talking about the books that I've written and the PhD and the books that we published will find this a kind of ars demonstrandum of the theoretical work beforehand. And in order to do that, I need to demonstrate to you some concepts in a bit more depth. But in effect, I'm going to be talking about this bit of London and that bit of London. This is a photograph of the office yesterday that Claudia took. That's Neve, our office manager, packaging up some books and new issue 5 of the Joker, and a large model of the first 2 floors and the ground plane of the project in Hoxton for Hackney Council. And there was hardly anybody there yesterday. People are kind of going back slowly, kind of in dribs and drabs, keeping their distance. And you can see that the office is quite typical. There's Angleboys lamps and has some nice chairs and big televisions. And then there's this horizon of stuff going around the meeting room, and really it's impossible for me to practice architecture without trying to combine the theoretical aspects of history and theory and the physical aspects of craft. And they kind of came together a few years ago in the publication of a book called Mimesis, and I wrote a couple of pieces for it, including this essay, Civic Architecture, which had kind of grown out of PhD research, and this stuff here is from the Venice Biennale in 2012, where it suddenly occurred to me that if you put civic in front of architecture, it orients it towards the city, it orients it towards an implication of ethics and history and other people. And architecture, which you cannot put civic in front of, suffers as a consequence in comparison. And running through the Venice Biennale work and my PhD was kind of visual work. This is an essay, visual essay that David Grandorge, long-term collaborator and friend, made. And this is Burlington House, which is now the Royal Academy, obviously. And this is New Zealand House, which I don't think the architects, when they designed it, were really thinking about the ground plane particularly hard. And they certainly probably weren't envisaging, 40 years later, horse guards still parading. And that seems to me to be a kind of fundamental problem within modernism. Obviously, the ground plane is problematic, and it's problematized in the 1980s and 1970s through postmodernist theories, from Louis Kahn's plan for a car-free Philadelphia to the figure ground drawings that became fashionable. And when we've kind of been growing a sort of critical approach to the simple tasks that we've been set, which in essence to do with this quite recently man-made territory of London, the old canal basin being filled in the 1860s, and the train station created the building of an embankment, meaning that this previously flooded land was no longer uninhabitable. And kind of looking quite closely at the modernist city, which is generally speaking all over the world dominated by car technology, with buildings that pay no heed to their solar orientation or to their proximity to the civic structure of the city. This building here is here. You know, it's right next to the major public buildings of Britain, and this is a building next to Westminster City Hall that was conjoined to it in the process of demolition that we were asked to work upon. And David was kind of recording this sort of seemingly characterless, monolithic, flat situation, lacking in depth, both in terms of the architecture, which is, you know, south-facing but air-conditioned and has no depth, and also the canyon-like appearance of the streets. But what we started to realise was that actually there is a series of fragments of historical architecture. This is Frank Matcham's Victoria Palace Theatre, juxtaposed with very tall 60s stuff, and then stuff in the recent past which attempts to deal with viewing corridors and the kind of setting of listed buildings stuff that came into being in the 1990s. And that it's a smorgasbord of a mixture of stuff, most of which seems to be kind of dealing with itself and nothing else. The more we looked, we realised there was a hinterland, and in fact, even with quite late modernist buildings, there was already an understanding of the groundscape. This is a tiny medieval alleyway which survived, and in fact, until recently, had a run and become a running sports shop and a non-vehicular pedestrian area where you can test out running shoes. And the essay kind of makes an argument, in effect, that civic architecture is the kind of great achievement of humanism, and Alberti's formulation of not only a theory of architecture is also a theory of city, a theory of city life, a theory of the family, and a theory of civic economy. And the more we looked, the more we realised that in fact this, as it were, kind of created in one go, man-made version of Italy accepted quite readily the capacity for the new and the old to coexist, and had a degree of depth that the surface reading of it doesn't really acknowledge. And in fact, there's a kind of strange kind of hierarchy of background buildings and hinterland buildings to the hierarchy of grand civic monuments. This is kind of version of a sort of Florentine cloister. It's part of the Catholic Church's holdings, and arguably that's always been the case in this bit of London. This was Banqueting House, which was kind of diminutive to the Palace of Westminster and the Crown, and a kind of middle ground, and itself it kind of articulates a kind of strange phenomena of what's known as generally kind of Queen Anne at the front and Sally Ann around the back, of a kind of facing material that's very strong, and cheaper materials around the back. And at certain points in the late 19th century and 20th century, this is Piccadilly that we were comparing it to. These things come together as urban infrastructural projects, where a hotel and a block of flats with shopping below take on a kind of civic scale. And within Mimesis, this was one kind of aspect of mimetic thought being analogical. Can you compare things that are distant geographically and historically to each other? And in this case, the Caldoro in Venice, on a kind of watery boulevard, we realised with a south-facing facade and a deep threshold between the very public and the very private, creates a kind of emotional, psychological, environmental buffer. And one aspect of the book, this is an essay by Laura Evans, who was part of the office then, it's just about craft, about learning through making things, and physically making models of the scale of the city, and then making drawings at the scale of the body. Gives you a kind of way to deal with the problem of object making, which has arguably got out of control, lacks a sense of scale, both in terms of the hierarchy of importance of various buildings physically, and arguably in terms of their decorum and their rhetoric, but also in terms of the human body's relationship to the city. And I've been proselytizing this, as some of you may know, on my Instagram account, showing both a kind of instant kind of physical act of thought in sketching and then more analytical work. This is a early version of a project I'm going to show you. And then this is just kind of, this is an engineer's drawing of a housing scheme I'm going to show you in a bit, which shows it kind of stripped down to its structural basics, both physical structure and also typological and formal and spatial structure. So the first project I'm going to talk to you about is the Coroner's Court for Westminster's Coroner's Court. And the project consists of a Garden of Remembrance that we built a few years ago, very quickly, with funds from the Grenfell fire tragedy, because the families of the bereaved were visiting this building very often. There was no accommodation for them, and a new building / extension, which includes a new Coroner's Court and a juror's room, and a garden of reflection for people who are using the Coroner's Court. So zooming in a bit, this is Westminster Abbey, Parliament Square, House of Parliament, Royal Family, Victorian train station, and that's the stuff that we're beginning to build. It's what we built a few years ago, and then over here is the Coroner's Court. So the Coroner's Court is very much in the kind of hinterland condition of this major urban thoroughfare, which, despite appearances, has a series of very important civic buildings, cathedral, town hall, and of course the major buildings of the state. And parts of what I'm showing you now, these are parts of the design and access statement for the planning application, which is going to committee next week. So I'm kind of taking the huge risk of talking in public about a project that is still very much live in consultation. This is a project for the cathedral that I'm not going to talk about. This is an office building, a residential building, a town hall, a pedestrian route that runs around the back, an office building, and a mixed-use building, including a library that wraps around a listed theatre. This is an office building, this is an office building, this is an early 19th century Georgian, mid to late 19th century faience facade, and the 21st century kind of evolution of language of a kind of formal foreground, and then a library to the rear. And this is the office building, this is the block of flats, this is the town hall, and in effect, growing from this process of model making, as well as a kind of understanding of a hierarchy of importance in terms of this kind of civic dimension of the city, the cathedral and the town hall, the tallest figures on the street. We effectively took a block which is oriented like the cathedral, not north-south, because the cathedral is built on the ruins of an old prison, which was in the marsh originally. We took one of these blocks and placed it here. This is kind of very much work done intuitively, instinctively, physically. And in doing so, I realized that this angle of incidence made the building subservient to and opened up a relationship between the town hall and what was previously occluded by an adjacent block. And then the kind of application of a 9 by 12 meter column grid to the office building gave us a kind of rhythm to the street where the buildings and the spaces between them have an equivalence. This is a view towards the town hall. From the west, the office building, the residential building, and the town hall itself. And then a problem of how do we place living apartments on a south-facing facade on a very busy boulevard, as it were. The solution is a stone, self-supporting solar screen. piers are closer together at the bottom, wider at the top, in order to protect the privacy of occupants and passers-by at the lower levels. And it has a kind of formal order to it, which is partly manipulated, largely just the result of the plan, but at certain points you become conscious of the need to give, even if the building is kind of subservient and passive in relationship to the major building, to give it some order. And then that allows the occupation of the facade and the ground plane to have a layer of temporality which is ad hoc. The plan is quite simple. There's a central core. The plan is quite deep. There's bedrooms in the centre of the plan with views outwards, glass corner. And every time you enter the flat, you have a view through a third bedroom or study through the facade. And in this case, it's through this bedroom. And the south facade is thick. And that's a view from that third bedroom I just showed you through the living space. The ceiling is lower over the kitchen. It gets higher towards the facade and higher at the facade. And this shows it in relationship to the both the kind of civic structure, but also the natural world. There's rough stone on the ground, and the handrail is angled in order to stop people putting drinks on it and thus complying with health and safety. But what I'm trying to get at here is that there's a sense in which the haptic physical aspects of architecture are also civic, because they're a dimension of care for the occupant. This is a door handle that we made, which is curved when you pull it and flat when you need to push it. This is the result of those geometric contextual moves. A kind of expanded threshold to the town hall, which is used when the town hall is the site for political activity, such as the strike by council workers and support of their colleagues who were on zero-hours contracts a few years ago. And this stuff still goes past. Probably the most explicit kind of dimension of the project is this artwork by Blaise Luxembourg. We're working with folk landscape architects. When we destroyed the existing building and created a new public route, entrance to the residential building, no seating, lots of bikes, we revealed this kind of scar of this original modernist building, and we're tasked with coming up with an idea of what to do with it. And rather than trying to embarrass it, we thought that we should do something which was monotone and relatively modest and background and subtle, and that the landscape itself and the kind of solar shading, the whole kind of ethos of green architecture would give us a way to deal with ornament in the way in which Alberti spoke about architecture as second nature in the Renaissance. And it's also very spatial, because at the point at which you enter the residential building, there's an ornamental stone column, and this artwork, which is a series of fragments of trees, kind of a visual noise, coalesces into a perspectival whole. So I think it was that got us on the radar of Westminster City Council. They'd employed a firm of architectural designers who were multidisciplinary surveyors, I think, in effect, and they'd done a scheme which was in effect to copy this segment of the Grade 2 listed building and place it here. And the planning department, God bless them, said, there's no way we're going to accept that. It's pastiche and wrong, and you need to get yourself a good architect. And via the kind of open portal, OG application process, we were able to get on a short list and then designed a project. Anyway, so this is more of that kind of Victoriana that grew up when the embankment was built. It's symmetrical. There's the Hackney carriages would go in here, would exit around the back. Hearses separately bringing bodies and taking them away. It's a kind of it's a physical manifestation of the Municipals Act in the middle of the last century. It's the state dealing with death, and dealing particularly with death in unusual circumstances, so crime, murder, but also kind of toxicology, infestation, pandemic, that kind of stuff. It has quite a low arch, a big bay window, which I'll explain in a bit more detail. And on the left, you can see the Garden of Remembrance that we built, and this is where we're building a new building. It's always been a mortuary, and this is the Queen's Coroner in West London is our client, and she's emphatic that it needs to be reinstated and it needs to work properly. At the moment, they're occupying a neighbouring building, spill out space, and it doesn't really work. But it's listed, it sits here. It was originally part of a terrace, and when they built the mortuary in the 1970s, they demolished the terrace and they created a taxi rank, which is a waiting area where bodies can be laid out if there's a temporary mortuary in place, i.e. this is in the Westminster disaster zone. So whenever there's a terrorist atrocity, or if there's God willing, an outbreak of a horrible disease or a nuclear strike, etc., this ground is part of this. And this is obviously lacking in decorum and entirely introverted and derived from its plan. And this is a kind of reaction to it, late 80s, 90s postmodernism. The building itself is faced in decent brick and Portland stone, and that's the Coroner's Court itself. So this is the mortuary, that's the Garden of Remembrance, that's the Coroner's Court, and this is the area we're going to extend. The bay window that I mentioned earlier, you may notice, projects out and has a kind of quasi-ingle situation where this is where you wait before you go into the Coroner's Court proper, which is a timber-lined room with a dais. The coroner sits here, has light coming from above, it has faience tiles. The only thing that makes it a Coroner's Court is this crest of the crown, which in effect embodies the agency of the law within the person of the coroner. And that's the side where the new building will be built. They basically weren't using Hackney carriages anymore, just built this very mute facade next to it and locked the space down in perpetuity. So we have to kind of be mindful of that. This is the immediate context, these kind of blank gables, niches of various saints. It's very kind of both the Anglican High Church movement and the Catholic Church back in its pomp are kind of creating a kind of implied depth. Very quickly it occurred to us that what we should do is something autonomous, but which is taking its clues and its keys spatially from the spatial typologies of the existing building, and that it should be the same height, no higher than the eaves, and that it should be stratified. So the striations of Portland stone should run across our new building, and that it should be mute to the north because of the proximity of the street and the possibility of paparazzi and the general public invading the privacy of the mourners. And that's a kind of small ground floor plan. We're going to do some demolition to the existing building and knocking below the windows on that western elevation and creating new openings. And this is the ground floor plan. I'm going to talk about this in a bit more detail in a sec, but in effect, we're making openings and building a new building. So at the moment, when you visit the building, if God willing, you won't have to do this, but if you're called by the police, you come here, you go into a room here in the mortuary where a body is laid out, you witness it, and you probably then want to escape. But there's lots of questions to be asked. So the Garden of Remembrance operates as a kind of immediate valve for people to occupy. 6 weeks later or so, after the coroner, if it's a straightforward case, it could be much longer, you return, you deal with the receptionist, and then you're placed into a kind of holding pattern. This is the family room whilst you wait before you go upstairs to the coroner's court. But you do have access to this space. Apparently, the coroner and policeman told me that basically everybody starts smoking almost immediately. if they're in this situation. It's very, very stressful, obviously. So this is the footprint of the new building. There's expanded workspace for the coroner's offices, and we're kind of generally making modifications to the back of house and the front of house, an existing lift. And the first floor, there's kind of bits of jiggery-pokery going on. You come up the grand staircase, that's the window seat. You go in this direction to the grand courtroom, or if you're going to if you're a juror and there's not a pandemic and there's only one court in session, you go this way, and this is a juror's room, this is the coroner's office, and this is the coroner's PA office. I'm going to show you in a bit more detail how this works in the case of when there's two courts in session. And then the floor above, we're refurbishing and creating facilities that enable the staff to work there all night. When the Grenfell fire happened, the coroner was sleeping on the leather benches in the coroner's court. There were no facilities, no showers, nowhere for them to kind of deal with the emergency situation. And so you can see here that this is the vaulted top-lit hall of the original coroner's court, and this is our new coroner's court, office extension on the ground floor and the plant below. And this is the kind of front bit, red brick and Portland stone, buff London brick here, paper window higher than the cornice line. So our section is cut in steps, and there's a light coming in at that point. It seemed to be very, very important that we should make the building appear to be an independent building. So it's lined in stone in the link corridor. There's 2 doors into the coroner's court, and those are the ancillary spaces. And it's very, very tall, and it's also flexible. It can be opened. These windows are recessive. These windows are flush. That's the elevation to the north. And in this kind of notion of it being part of, but not the same, it's different types of Jura limestone. The same limestone we would use on the facade of the that we used on Kingsgate, and that's the Garden of Remembrance. Now the Garden of Remembrance happened before the building was to be built. It was all to be built at one point, but because of the Grenfell fire, there had been a porter cabin here, and it was removed. And up until the point where this was created, people were sitting on the pavement outside. There was no succour, no physical space for them. The kind of edicular, small house microcosm that we know from John Summerson's Heavenly Mansions as a kind of typical figure of the Gothic and of the 19th century in general reappears here. These are planters and benches. We've sourced that. It's a reclamation yard thing. They're gardens, but they have this kind of focus. The ground slopes slightly. It's fine precast concrete. The arch figure reappears within the niche. This is polished. This is rough. As you stand in front of it, your shadow, but also a kind of ghostly reflection of yourself, is held within this niche. The building proper is this plus this piece of land that we're co-opting, and we're making a new garden, as I mentioned, so that the plants in the faience become embodied in the spatial setting. There's a new pond, a new tree. This wall hides kind of back of house stuff, and effectively it's a kind of shroud to this very, I don't know, I suppose you could call it brutalist. I don't really like using those stylistic terms. I think it's just kind of slightly introverted architecture. You can understand why. It's the epitome of kind of hygiene and factory modernism. But there's this front of house aspect that hopefully will give some kind of dignity to the experience of the users. And the glass link between the two will be a kind of celebration. One of the problems of the Coroner's Court is that lots of famous people their bodies are interned there, and they basically suffer from intrusion in security. So rather than having Georgian wire or etched glass, we teamed up with Brian Clark, who's an old friend, and two ex-students of mine from the CAS who work there, Francesco Bastatin and Christian MacDonald. Cunningham office. And so the role of the stained glass is both functional. It blocks your view. It allows the new and the old to sit together well, but also very succinctly, Brian beautifully described his experience of going there as a grieving mourner, and that foliate imagery for him, regardless of the religious connotations of this kind of secular municipal architecture, is hopeful. It's uplifting. This is some work on the way in Brian's studio. So it's engineered timber, Jura limestone, and stained glass. So one problem we have is that if there's a terrorist attack and the land around and will be changed from a taxi rank to a temporary mortuary, the builder has to leave site with 2 hours' notice. So engineered timber becomes effectively the only way really we can build it, and that things can be left and then not decay or deteriorate. That concrete material will be dangerous. So this is a diagram showing how stuff would arrive and be stacked and then clad, and then this is what will result. So the area where we're using for build from becomes the new garden. Just going to walk you through the building. This is the entrance, a new arch, new open reception desk, a view into the family room, which is similarly kind of adicular and inglenook-like, and a door out to the garden, a view the other way. So kind of butte fabric, stained plywood, an arch that we're making to the lift. This is the new office space. That's the engineered timber column. Very precisely calibrated storage and privacy for the coroner's staff to take difficult telephone conversations. The link through to the new building, it's not the new building, but you know what I mean. It's kind of, it needs to be discreet. There's an edicular kind of portico that holds a door that's open most of the time for the coroner to walk freely, but when the second court is in session, the jurors are there, is not. And this is the step in the ceiling I mentioned earlier with one of Brian's artwork. So this is the moment that you would leave the courtroom, and at that point this kind of ambient foliage crystallizes into the symbol of a flower. And this is the effect of the stained glass on the south elevation, flooding the space with light. And similarly, it would affect the coroner's court, animated. And this is the large double height space in use for a juror's court. That's the pond, that's the office, that's the engineered timber lined in acoustic boarding, top lit. And then these plans show this room as a juror's room, this room as a small courtroom, this room is a larger courtroom. So this is a folding timber wall. And then these images, just to conclude, are this is the space on a dull day, this is the effect of the sun coming around to the west through the stained glass, and then the sun coming in late afternoon when the coroner will be summing up through the tree. So the second nature and actual nature kind of coalesce in a manner that the Garden of Remembrance does at the moment. Okay, I'm going to have to speed up a bit. If you have any questions left. So in effect, the kind of civic example that Victorian architecture took from the Renaissance, which itself was a kind of rebirth of antique morals and kind of politics and democracy and the arts, informed 19th century architecture, seemed to get kind of lost in the 20th century, obviously, especially towards the period of the 60s and 70s in the UK and America, where the car and the individual rights of the car owner seemed to kind of dominate. And this is Hackney. Our site is here. And just to kind of give you a bit more kind of orientation, that's Old Street Roundabout. This is Clerkenwell and the Angel, the Regent's Canal, Shoreditch Park. Chipperfield's built some towers here recently. and this is our site. This is Shoreditch Park, which was, I suppose, in better hands, such in the way in which Victoria Park, the buildings around it form a kind of urban foil to artificial wilderness. This would have a clearer sense of place, and it doesn't. This is 1960s tower, Thaxted Court, two-storey car park block. And so you get this kind of stuff where the necessity to orient people because of the disorienting effects of point blocks, modernist architecture seemingly dropped from above, means it's very difficult to orient yourself. And we'd assumed, so this is effectively our site. This is the tower, this is the car park. But this was bomb damage. This was the site in 1870, quite a decent neoclassical Church of England church. This is Shepherdess Walk. There's kind of fragments of this left all over Hackney. And we assumed that all this had been bombed. And that, because it's kind of inconceivable that you would draw a line like that around a bit of city. But actually, the black is the bomb damage, destruction, and the purple is parts of it. And actually, this is the site here. There's some 1930s Peabody housing. It wasn't destroyed in the war. It was still like this in 1950. That was it in 1960, and that's the site today. And so the council, when they were building the housing, were kind of culpable, I guess, for a sort of quantity surveyor, project manager-led ignorance of the Victorian society. John Betjeman's great endeavour was kind of beginning. The listing was kind of beginning, but they destroyed effectively kind of grain of 19th century city, and they dropped this block in and this block in and this block in and this block in. It's not oriented north-south. It's not really oriented towards the street, either that one or that one. And as a consequence, it's kind of alienated. It works unto itself as a composition of smaller and larger elements. I don't know quite what they thought this was going to be, but it ended up being this car park. And so Hackney Council has the ability to build lots of housing, because lots of this modernist stock sits in seas of non-determinate ground, and the kind of ground level experience of this, whilst they kept the street pattern, is quite alienating. This is literally the influence of car-based technology. But you can see a kind of stylistic contextualism. The white render and the red brick and the buff brick of the Georgian and Victorian stock is sort of played out. If one's being extremely sympathetic and empathetic. This is 1950s housing stock, kind of mid-rise, a lot better. This is the new stuff that's starting to go up. But as you look closer at this stuff, you start to realise quite how literally disconnected it is from the city. So by excavating and building a basement car park, they need to ventilate it, so they cut the street off from the building. And this is actually the entrance to the estate. It rises up to get you over the basement, because they couldn't dig deeper because there's a series of rail and Royal Mail infrastructural tunnels running beneath, and literally dislocated. I mean, we're all aware of this phenomenon. I've kind of started to theorise it as the problem of civic ground. And this is Hoxton Court, and because this is at the moment the delivery route for the it's a kind of fire engine ingress and access for bins, you get this sort of bollards and white lines, and then because they've excavated this bit of the city, it's just disconnected from the other bit of the city. That's the 1930s estate. It's much better, but similarly, ground floor doesn't really work. There's lots of housing, lots of kind of municipal patches of ground, and this is just the north of our site, a community garden that's grown up, which is in here. So at the moment, servicing works like this. That's the cars. That's the car park. These are taller buildings going towards Old Street Roundabout and smaller buildings going towards Islington, and this kind of anomaly of these point blocks. And we kind of, actually, because we'd lived in this area for quite a long time, knew that there was some very good architecture, so some Bates and more recent stuff and our stuff, that was attempting to kind of deal with this fragmented city. This is our old office, obviously, you might know about this. We added this floor. Our office was there originally. We had a child, so we kind of moved up there. Lightweight construction, and a view looking west, and that's Thaxter Court in the background. So we knew the area very well. We knew the problem of road-based urban design, this kind of non-determinate or non-linear situation, and the antisocial behaviour that comes from it. A kind of analogical collage saying that, well, if the best housing in the UK is the Barbican, but it similarly suffers from being occluded from the city at ground floor because it's basically a car park. And this is Aldo Rossi's housing at Galatasaray. So how might we combine those two things together, and taking advantage of the fact there is lots of greenery and pretty decent estates around about, to create something that could fuse the best aspects of both. So we pretty quickly came up with the idea of two blocks. One block which aligns to Murray Grove, and one block which is perpendicular to the tower, and when you project that forwards, it's also perpendicular to the street, that we would service the building that way. This is one of Claudia's sketches. Her idea was doing this and this. She's pathologically shy and refuses to speak in public, so you have to bear with me because I have to do this. And she's the director in charge of this project, so bear with me if I make mistakes. So that was our original site. We proposed two buildings. Then we started to realise that in fact there was space for another building if we moved the ramp that would deal with that approach to the estate. And eventually where we got to after a long period of consultation was that we would get rid of the car park. We would use the spoil for our excavations to level the ground. We would have some car parking spaces for the existing residents that slowly would dissipate, and bring the servicing in from here. And that we would create a middle ground of city in between these very tall elements, the medium scale and kind of mid-rise stuff and lower stuff. And then it became a game about the ground, architecture of the ground and architecture of the sky. So this is a section through the existing tower and the car park that we would introduce these new buildings, mediating between this scale and that scale. This 10-storey, 18-storey, 8-storey, 8-storey, and 1990s block there. And then that's the foreground, a section through the site. That's north, that's south. The shared basement. That's the 3 new blocks and an axometric. So it's effectively a new composition that incorporates the alienated architecture of the 1960s into the existing street pattern. It doesn't imitate the architecture of the Victorian city, but it attempts ultimately to try and reconfigure the modernist typology so that you get a sense of a new urban composition, almost as if this was phase 1 and this was phase 2, as if the kind of knowledge that we now have of the problems of the ground plane in modern architecture and a postmodern typological reading of city has been added to the existing situation. Okay, we're going to try and rush through a lot of stuff now. In effect, the structural columns of the existing building become typological elements now, a south-facing garden and a deep threshold between the interior and the garden space. The landscape is designed by Muff and Peter Bryan, a really excellent team. There's bikes in this building, retail here, office space here, kind of bin stores and stuff there, community room there, and existing trees added to with a new fringe of soft landscaping, and this colonnade that shrouds the fact that this is the service route now for the bins and the fire, but also the car parking spaces. We're planting trees within it, so as population that own cars die out, more trees will be planted. It's a kind of summation, a diagram of all of this. And this is that model I was talking about that we made as a way to try and deal with the ground plane. The formal figure ground and the kind of plan of the buildings happened quite quickly and quite rational, but the problem of fixing the ground was very, 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 very complicated and difficult. This is kind of less public. This is very public. This is kind of public. This is a new piazza. And one idea is that we've had is that the ground plane of the buildings will push out, and the spatial character will project into the strong forms of the architecture. That's the workspace. That's the residential entrance. This is a view from the south. It's got a grand loggia, and that's the new raised ground. There's a slight slope going up to the tower, but in effect, what we're creating is a kind of perspectival vista towards the existing tower by aligning the two buildings on the street to the street. You create perspectiva naturalis, and then this long loggia element, as well as shrouding the service entrance, acts as a bus stop. This is kind of muffs elaboration on what we're doing. This is a view from the existing duplex apartments looking out onto the tower, the workspace, the new grounds, and a view on Murray Grove. So in effect, if the condition of the modern city was flatness and singular function, what we're aiming, in the words of Peter Carr, is towards civic depth. This is the community room, the vaulted ceiling, simple bench, possibility of temporal complexity. The materials of the building, it's a concrete frame building. Grenfell paid to the issue of engineered timber and non-load bearing brickwork. A simple thing I want to mention is that the windows in a social housing block and a housing estate need to be no higher than 850, so a wheelchair bound person can look out. There's a problem then of falling, so there's a bronze handrail which runs around, which it's bronze anodized aluminium, gets filled in with filigrane lacework when it encounters a window and otherwise runs across. And then there's a mosaico of the big balconies with arch ceilings, creating a kind of another layer between the individual apartment and the city. It's a view from the east, the deep threshold that's created by the offset geometric orientation towards the tower. The first floor looks like, the floors above look like this. This is the golden handrail running by. This is a south elevation approaching the building. The ground floor of the south block. This is workspace. This is retail on 2 levels. This is community room. The staircase has to push out like that. Let's getting closer to it. Creating a bench below. Floors 1 to 3 have a 1-bed apartment here, south facing. The floors above, effectively, central core, and it's all about how you organise and orient views towards this L-shaped balcony. That's where the vaulted space is. Cores are repetitive, so this flat's the same as that flat. That basically gives you this condition where the balcony is not bolted on, it's not separate to the living space and extension of it. Floors above, they just set in, giving you then this particular vault, like a cap to the building. That's the public space between them. The socially rented block, the other buildings for sale is basically the same. Same plan organisation. There's no 1-bed flat there. And that's what I was talking about. This kind of deep threshold, working at the level of the ground plane and of the apartment, and a degree of detail that hopefully allows you to situate yourself in a collective. And the West Block, I'm concluding now with this, don't worry, kind of running through to the end. That's its ground plane. It's riffing on this rather, I don't know what you call it, kind of mute, not particularly sensitive 1990s building, but Champfort becomes the figure in the plan here. So these are 2-bed apartments with a larger terrace and a smaller terrace, west light, south light. And that's a view back towards the taller figure. And hopefully then this modernist hinterland becomes part of a considered composition. So this kind of 2 tall stuff and 2 mute stuff suddenly talk to each other. That's the ambition. And just the last thing I'm going to show you is we realised quite recently when we were putting our tender drawings together, it's going for planning next month, and the tender drawings are part of the planning set, so that in the design build contract scenario, what we have planning consent for must be built. In effect, the rhythm of the Georgian or early Victorian houses of a 5-metre party wall architecture is reinscribed in the geometric rhythm of the colonnade. What was a Baptist chapel becomes this public space. Okay, that's the conclusion of the possibility of the Civic in Westminster and Hackney. If there's any time left for questions, maybe.
Please, thank you, Patrick. Why don't we stop sharing your screen and then we can see you properly. Fantastic. I mean, it always strikes me, it's so unusual in Britain to find an architect who can talk about or make connections between theory and practice in a very kind of confident way as you just have. And in a way, I always think that the figures in the UK who are capable of that often have come from elsewhere, whether it's Dimitri Porphyrios at one end or Patrick Schumacher at the other. But it feels very
I'm in the middle.
Un-British characteristics. It's a pleasure to see. I mean, I hope, yeah, we've got about 7-8 minutes left, so do please put your questions now rather than when we have 1 minute left to go. But I was reminded, Patrick, we've been in correspondence in the last couple of weeks because you've been organising this campaign for Marie-José Van Hey to win the Royal Gold Medal, which I was very happy to support. And I was reminded, kind of, when you were showing particularly the public space, is the illustration of the public spaces in the last project, of the kind of sensibility you find in the public realm project that Marie-José and Robrecht and Dam have undertaken together. The Leopold de Valplatz scheme in Antwerp and the Market Hall in Ghent, particularly, where they're kind of characterised by it's a public realm that's characterised by a kind of multiplicity of characteristics and a real interest in making intimacy within a public territory. And I think Muff's work often, shares that preoccupation and an interest in making space for a sort of multiple voices for artists, certainly, and for landscape architecture, as you've kind of shown in the work that you've done. This feels, I mean, I think one could make the case that there's a sort of quite a distinct sensibility towards what public space might be today from anything that could have been, we might have seen in the kind of, say, the 1960s or 70s. Do you sense that there's a sort of, as much as you're drawing connections to history, you are interested in making a new kind of public space that's reflective of a new sort of society?
Yeah, I do. I think that partly what my theoretical work is doing, i.e. the PhD work is doing, is trying to find resonances historically, which obviously get distorted, or as Harold Bloom would say, there's a kind of poetic swerve occurs. And obviously in the late 60s and 70s, partly because of the CAM conferences, but also publications like Complexity and Contradiction and The Architecture of the City, etc. There was a sort of a counter-reaction against modernism, which is often seen as conservative. I don't think postmodernism was operating like that. It certainly wasn't in film and music and the visual arts. And so what I'm not attempting to work typologically, i.e. through definition and clarity, and that this equals that. Andre Lynch, the critic, said about Marie-José's work that instead it's not operating kind of entirely cerebrally. It's to do with illusion, atmosphere, mutation, and I think also that in effect you're dealing with the other, and so working with other people is the only way to achieve this. There was an attempt, I think, by Bernard Schumi et al. To talk about cross-programming as a way to kind of undo the problems of modernist zoning of cities and functionalist introversion of building types. But that was yet more kind of program, and it was generated by the individual. I think that where I've got to is I realise that artists think very differently to us architects, and when architects try to be artists, it's very problematic. They talk about sculptural form, it becomes object-based, or and you see in the tension between, as I wrote back in the book Civic Ground, that the attempts of Peter Eisenman to work with Richard Serra didn't really they exploded in a kind of confrontation. And one of the things that MUF are very good at, and Marie-José and Romesh and Dama seem to realise, is that the more voices they lead to conflict, but they also lead to dialogue, and they lead to what the Greeks would call agon, i.e. the kind of confrontation which births something new. And that's really the point of learning from history. Is not to say these buildings were perfect. They were in, the Palazzo Rucellai, for example, is not finished. There's a bay missing because the Rucellai family could have built it. And Alberti's great gift to them was to allow them, or to persuade them to buy the space in front of the palazzo and build the stoa or loggia for observing the feast days. So there's a kind of question about what is the agency of the architect. Is it just formal? No. Is it just sociological? No. Is it something between the two? Yes. Is it something that needs other people to complete it? Absolutely, definitely. And so if you think in terms of temporality rather than function, you create naturally a more layered architecture. The problem then is the architecture completely mute in background, or does it have enough character to allow things to be taken over? I think one of the problems of modernism is we realise people don't like being told what to do. They also don't like it when you don't give them any idea about how to behave. So you have a kind of non-lieu, as Marc Auger, the French sociologist, described it, a sense of dislocation. And so too much and not enough is kind of what I'm getting at. But you don't know if it's too much until you've done too much, and only then can you edit. So from after the great maximalists, I'm kind of we're working back and forth. But Liza are kind of very, 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 very rigorous practical thinkers, and their consultation is entirely kind of physical and emotional and personal and political, and also very creative. Things evolve in very unusual ways. My take on what Marie-José is doing is at the moment I'm writing a longer piece about this, is that perhaps it owes something to Belgian surrealism, to Magritte, and to Michel Bouremans. There's a kind of acceptance of difference. And
I think so in her work, and I think in yours too, that it's interesting when the presence of nature in the work is always a disruptive presence. I think that it's kind of rus in urbes. It's not a neat bit of municipal landscaping. It's something that's come from outside the city or has burst up from beneath the city, and introduced a sort of acknowledgement of temporality, of seasonal change and daily change. I mean, I guess things like in Marie-José and Robert and Dam's work, for instance, the great Christina Iglesias fountain at Leopold de Valplatz, where this sort of the water bubbles up on a restating the sort of the rhythm of the nature that's kind of been lost in the centre of the city.
And also the fireplace in the market hall, which is used for the festival. And the festival is a thing that brings the natural world, the produce of farming into the city. And I think that's kind of where I got to in my thinking, is that the attempt to apply ornament or as a representation of nature kind of got very fashionable about 10 or 15 years ago. You see a whole Herzog and de Meuron and people trying to do that, but that's not really what Alberti was talking about when he was talking about ornament. It's the interpenetration of the natural world, death, joyful celebration of the seasons and festival. And I think you're absolutely right. That's what's going on with Marie José. But it's also the fireplace in the market hall, because that is, it's unbelievably striking and shocking that something really alive, like a fire can happen and a festival can happen. There's a whole quotidian layer of everyday stuff, and more or less kind of curated stuff. But there's also the spontaneity, and that at heart is the thing that I think is my critique of modernity, is that it's rationalism trying to control, try to understand human activity through control, and I don't think that's where we are now. I think that and I think Marie José's dissertation for her master's degree was about the role of the medieval garden in the city and in painting, and I wrote my MPhil was about the Baroque city and the role of gardens and festivals. So yes, I think you're quite precise in your observation. Yes, it is that. I think in a Catholic context, they're working in Belgium. It's the festival. The 19th century kind of Anglo-Catholic culture that gave birth to Victoria had a sense of that. There was lots and lots of possessions and a kind of overlayering of paganism and Marian worship and attempts to kind of go back to beating the bounds of the parish and adoration of the Virgin Mary. There's a sense that within modernity there's something missing, which is Mother Nature, perhaps. So something more sustaining than just architecture.